Before Hitler came to power, German medicine was among the most advanced in the world. German doctors pioneered new surgical methods, developed vaccines, and explored genetics. But in 1933, everything changed. A new ideology took control, one that placed racial purity above human life. Science, once a tool to heal, became a weapon to destroy. The Nazi regime believed that the German people were a master race. To justify this, they turned to scientists and doctors, asking them to provide proof. Many leading physicians and professors agreed, willingly trading their ethics for influence and power. In their minds, they were serving a higher purpose, reshaping humanity itself. That was how medicine in Nazi Germany lost its soul. Laboratories that once saved lives became places of death. Under the slogan, "For the sake of progress," secret facilities were built where experiments were carried out on men, women, and children, without anesthesia, without mercy, without humanity. It started with the T4 euthanasia program in 1939. Officially, it was a policy to help the incurably ill die peacefully. In reality, it was mass murder. More than 70,000 people, mental patients, the disabled, children with deformities, were killed by injection, gas, or starvation. This was the rehearsal for the gas chambers that would soon appear in Auschwitz. When war broke out, the experiment spread beyond Germany's borders. In the concentration camps of occupied Europe, Dachau, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, special medical sections were created. Prisoners were subjected to horrific tests in the name of science. They were frozen in ice water to study hypothermia. They were infected with malaria and typhus. They were cut open and injected with experimental drugs, poisons, and even seawater to see how long they could survive without fresh water. Some were used to test high-altitude pressure chambers. Others were operated on without anesthesia, simply to observe how the body reacted. The justification was always the same, for the good of the German soldier. The data, they claimed, would help treat wounds, infections, and trauma. In the twisted minds of these scientists, the suffering of a few thousand prisoners was worth the survival of the superior race. But behind the scientific reports and medical jargon lay something darker, a sense of sadistic curiosity. Many of these doctors stopped seeing their victims as people. They were specimens, numbered and tagged like lab rats. Photographs were taken before and after each procedure, vital signs recorded until the very last breath. Every death became a data point. They wore white coats. They called themselves healers. But in the end, they were executioners with stethoscopes. By 1941, the Nazi war machine was at its peak. Behind the front lines, a different kind of army was forming, an army in white coats, armed not with rifles, but with scalpels, syringes, and notebooks. The SS had realized that human experimentation could be as useful as any weapon. And so, they created a medical empire inside the concentration camps. Each major camp had its own research department. Dachau focused on aviation and survival experiments. Ravensbrück studied bone transplants and sterilization. Buchenwald tested vaccines and chemical agents. And Auschwitz, perhaps the most infamous of all, became the center of genetic research and racial science. At the top of this system stood Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Cold and calculating, Himmler saw medicine as a tool to shape the future of the German race. He personally approved dozens of experiments, sending letters to camp commanders demanding faster and more conclusive results. Under his orders, doctors were given complete freedom, no ethics, no oversight, no limits. Among these doctors, a few names would forever become synonymous with horror. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. Educated, charming, and disturbingly polite, Mengele was obsessed with heredity. At Auschwitz, he selected twins for his experiments, hundreds of pairs of children, often taken from the trains arriving from across Europe. One twin would be infected or operated on, while the other would serve as a control. When one died, the other was killed for comparison. Mengele recorded everything with meticulous precision, believing he was uncovering the secrets of genetics. Then there was Dr. Sigmund Rascher, who worked in Dachau. His experiments focused on how the human body reacted to extreme conditions, cold, heat, and lack of oxygen. Prisoners were placed in freezing water until they lost consciousness, their temperature monitored as they slowly died. Others were put into pressure chambers that simulated high-altitude flight, often resulting in violent convulsions and death. Rascher justified it all as a contribution to aviation medicine. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, was another key figure. He supervised the entire T4 program and coordinated medical projects across the Reich. After the war, he would claim he only followed orders, but his signature appeared on thousands of death certificates, and there were dozens more: Schilling, Klauberg, Hurt, Gebhardt, each running their own projects, each seeing human beings as data points in a grand, monstrous study. What made these men truly terrifying wasn't just their cruelty, it was their calmness. They believed they were scientists. They spoke of their victims as subjects and their killings as procedures. In their reports, you won't find the words pain or horror. Instead, you'll see terms like reaction time, rate of survival, anomalous response. They convinced themselves they were serving humanity. But the humanity they spoke of had no place for compassion, only for control. Even as the war began to turn against Germany, the experiments didn't stop. If anything, they grew more desperate, more prisoners, more tests, more death. The laboratories of the Reich were working day and night, trying to prove that science could still serve the ideology that had already doomed them all. The victims of Nazi medical experiments were not soldiers. They were ordinary people: Jews, Poles, Russians, Roma, and political prisoners, men, women, and children taken from their homes and stripped of their names. Inside the camps, they were no longer human. They were numbers tattooed on skin, subjects on a clipboard, material for research. Most didn't even know what was about to happen. They were told it was a medical check, an examination, or a vaccination. Then came the injections, the operations, the ice baths, the pressure chambers. Many never left the room alive. At Ravensbrück, the women's camp, hundreds of female prisoners were used to test new antibiotics and surgical procedures. Their legs were cut open, bones broken, and wounds infected deliberately with bacteria, dirt, and shards of glass to study healing methods. The women called themselves the rabbits because of the way they hopped after their surgeries. One survivor later said, "We were young, we wanted to live. They cut us, poisoned us, left us to rot, and still, we sang." At Dachau, victims were submerged in freezing water to study hypothermia. Many died after hours of agony. Those who survived were revived only to be tortured again. The doctors wanted to learn how long German pilots could survive in the cold waters of the North Sea. At Buchenwald, prisoners were injected with experimental vaccines and diseases: typhus, malaria, tuberculosis, sometimes all at once. Their bodies became laboratories, and in Auschwitz, Dr. Mengele's twins were subjected to countless horrors: blood transfusions, eye injections, amputations. He smiled at them like a teacher before dissecting them like animals. When one twin died, the other was killed the same day, so their organs could be compared. There was no way to refuse. The SS selected victims at random, or based on appearance, ethnicity, or health. Children were taken from their mothers. Prisoners too weak to work became volunteers. Those who screamed or fought were beaten unconscious before the experiment began. Many begged for death when it was over. "They told us it was for science," one prisoner said years later. But science would never do this to its own children. Some doctors and prisoners tried to document what they saw. Secret notes were hidden under floorboards or buried in jars near the barracks. Photographs were smuggled out, blurred, half-burned, but real, and a few prisoners, against all odds, survived. A Polish nurse from Ravensbrück testified after the war. "I remember their faces, not their numbers, faces. That is why I lived, to say their names again." When the camps were liberated, the Allied soldiers found the evidence: skeletons, medical records, organs preserved in jars. It wasn't science. It was hell, wearing a white coat. These experiments did not bring progress. No discovery, no cure, no breakthrough ever came from them. Only death, and the eternal question: how far can people go when they stop seeing others as human? The doctors claimed they were searching for knowledge. What they found was the bottom of the human soul. By late 1944, the walls of the Reich were crumbling. The Red Army was closing in from the east, the Allies from the west. And deep inside the camps, the doctors of death began to panic. For years they had worked without conscience, believing the war would never end, believing no one would ever see what they had done. Now, the front was moving closer every day, and the evidence of their crimes could not be hidden forever. Orders came from Berlin: eliminate all traces. Laboratories were emptied, documents burned, test subjects executed. In some camps, the SS shot hundreds of prisoners overnight to keep them silent. In others, the doctors themselves performed the killings. At Ravensbrück, the rabbit women, the victims of surgical experiments, were marked for execution. They knew it. They waited in silence. But other prisoners hid them, disguising them among the sick, smuggling them between barracks until liberation. A few survived and later testified, naming every doctor, every face. In Dachau, Dr. Rascher tried to destroy his research on hypothermia and high-altitude pressure, but the Allies captured the camp before he could finish. When American investigators opened the laboratory, they found charts, photographs, and handwritten reports describing cooling curves of the human body as prisoners froze to death. The data was labeled valuable medical information. At Auschwitz, Josef Mengele disappeared days before the Red Army arrived. He left behind rooms filled with glass jars, organs, eyes, fetuses, each carefully catalogued. Some jars were still warm. It was not medicine. It was madness with a microscope. When Allied troops entered the camps in 1945, they were not prepared for what they found. They had seen war, death, and destruction, but nothing like this. In Buchenwald, they discovered human skin stretched into lampshades. In Dachau, the medical barracks were still filled with corpses from experiments. In Auschwitz, they found children's clothes, surgical tables, and notebooks stained with blood. American, British, and Soviet soldiers photographed everything. They forced local civilians and German doctors to walk through the camps, to see what their civilization had done. Some refused to believe it even as the smell of death surrounded them. "I thought I had seen all that war could do," one American medic said. "But here, I saw what man could do." In 1946, the Allied powers began the doctor's trial in Nuremberg. 23 German physicians and scientists were charged with crimes against humanity. Many defended themselves by saying, "We only followed orders." But the judges refused that excuse. The court established the Nuremberg Code, the first set of principles for ethical medical research. It declared that no experiment could ever be done without voluntary consent, that human life and dignity must come before all science. It was a code written in the ashes of the camps. Many of the doctors were hanged. Others, like Mengele, escaped. He fled to South America, living under false names for decades until his death in Brazil in 1979. He never faced trial, never apologized, never regretted. But even for those who were punished, justice came too late. Too many lives had already been taken, too many families erased. The victims were gone, but their stories could no longer be buried. When the war ended, the world tried to look away. It was easier to celebrate victory than to face what had been done in the name of science. But the photographs, the testimonies, the piles of bones, they could not be erased. They stared back at humanity like a mirror no one wanted to see. The Nazi experiments forced the world to ask a question it had never asked before. What happens when knowledge is separated from conscience? In the years that followed, doctors, scientists, and philosophers tried to understand how it could have happened. How could men trained to heal become architects of suffering? The answer was not madness. It was obedience, ambition, and ideology. Many of those who worked in the camps were not monsters in appearance. They had studied in universities, sworn oaths to save lives. They wrote polite letters to their superiors, attended concerts after work, and then went back to dissecting human beings the next morning. That was what frightened the world most. Evil had not come with horns or rage. It had come with calm, methodical logic, wrapped in the language of progress. The road to Auschwitz, a survivor once said, was built by hatred, but paved with indifference. The same indifference that let the experiments continue for years. The same indifference that made some Allied powers quietly use the stolen data after the war because it was scientifically useful. Even horror had value if it could serve another purpose. In medical schools today, the Nazi experiments are still studied, not for what they discovered, but for what they destroyed. Students learn the Nuremberg Code, the Hippocratic Oath, the ethics that now protect every patient. But the lesson is not about law or procedure. It is about remembering how fragile humanity becomes when it hides behind reason. Every injection, every scar, every name in those ledgers is a warning. Science without empathy becomes cruelty. Progress without morality becomes destruction. Those who forget that truth are doomed to repeat it. In 1947, at the ruins of Dachau, a nurse laid flowers where the victims of hypothermia tests had died. A year later, one of the surviving rabbits from Ravensbrück returned to Poland and built a small hospital in her hometown. She said, "They called us subjects, but we were people, and people can rebuild." Her words became the quiet anthem of those who lived, that even after everything, after the smoke, the screams, the white coats stained red, life found a way to begin again. The legacy of the Nazi experiments is not a story of medicine or war. It is the story of how a civilization with the greatest universities and brightest minds lost its soul, and how the world swore never to let it happen again. Because when science forgets humanity, it doesn't just destroy lives, it destroys the meaning of life itself. When the war finally ended, the world stood in disbelief. It wasn't just the number of the dead that shocked humanity, it was the way they had died. The Nazi medical experiments weren't accidents of war, they were choices. They revealed what happens when ideology replaces empathy, when science stops asking why and starts asking only how far. The liberation of the camps showed humanity something it had never seen before. That knowledge could be used not to heal, but to humiliate. That progress could be measured not in discoveries, but in suffering. In 1945, when Allied doctors and soldiers entered the ruins of the Third Reich, they weren't just liberators, they were witnesses. They saw journals filled with data on dying men, bones arranged on tables, charts tracking heartbeats that slowly disappeared. Some of those soldiers couldn't sleep for years. They had looked at the face of science without a soul. The aftermath of these crimes reshaped modern medicine. Out of the ashes came something new: ethics. The Nuremberg Code, created after the doctor's trial in 1946, became the foundation of every modern rule for human research. It said one simple thing: no human experiment is justified without consent, without dignity, without life being the first priority. It seems obvious now, but in 1945, it wasn't. Before the war, there were no clear limits, no universal law to protect patients. The Nazis forced the world to define what humanity actually means. After Nuremberg, every country that called itself civilized had to look in the mirror. Could they claim to be different? Because some, in secret, still use the Nazi data, the freezing tests, the altitude results, the infection studies, arguing it might save lives. It was an ethical nightmare. Use the data and betray the victims, or destroy it and lose what they suffered for. There was no clean answer, only guilt. Today, decades later, the photographs are still shown in medical schools, not to teach medicine, but to teach morality. Professors remind their students, you are not here to experiment on life, you are here to protect it. Because the greatest danger is not that these things happen once, it's that they could happen again if people forget how easily ordinary men can become monsters when they stop asking what is right. The story of Nazi medical experiments is not just about cruelty. It's about civilization itself, how fragile it can be, how fast it can fall. A society that believed it was the most advanced on Earth built its future on corpses and called it progress. That is why these stories must never fade, not because we owe it to the dead, but because we owe it to the living.